good morning, everybody. Happy May 4th. My name is Richard Green. I'm director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate. And it's my pleasure to invite you to a combined Lusk Perspectives USC Price webinar presentation on barriers to building housing in California. The foundation for this particular event is a paper that I wrote with my colleague Lois Takahashi and Evgeny Burinskiy, who I will be introducing to you in a few minutes. This paper was funded by the California Housing Foundation. And so let me begin this event by introducing Dan Dunmoyer, who is the CEO of the Building Industry Association and a board member, actually the secretary of the CHF. So Dan, thanks so much for being here.
Professor Green, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity, and it is an honor to be a sponsorship of this study. As Professor said, the California Home Building Foundation's mission is to advance the home building industry in California, and they do so by providing scholarships and publishing like today, and innovative research findings, and promoting workforce education programs. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, and every dollar donated in support of this foundation is part of the building industry's legacy in supporting research and supporting young people joining the building industry, both on the trade level and all the way up to leadership roles in companies as CEOs of home building organizations. So we're honored today to be part of this discussion and honored to support today's research. Turn it back to you, Richard. Thank you again.
Dan, thank you so much. And again, thanks to the CHF for providing the funding so that we could do this study. And with that, let me turn it over to two people. First of all, one of our co-authors on this study, Evgeny Burinskiy, Evgeny Burinskiy. Evgeny is a freshly minted USC Ph.D. He defended his dissertation on April 22nd. And if you're the sort of person who likes to read Ph.D. dissertations, I will commend Evgeny's to you. It's about some very important issues revolving around the impact of transit on migration patterns and on the industrial organization of the building industry on the rents that people pay in the places that they live. And terrifically rigorous. And it was just a pleasure to be, I will just say, Evgeny's mentor over the past 2 or 3 years. Evgeny will be presenting the report, and then to comment on it, we have one of the, I think, best known, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say, most respected people in the home building industry, Bert Selva. Bert runs Shea Homes, has for at least 13 years, and I know that because he was running it when I took over as director of the Lusk Center. Bert, I should know exactly when you took over, but I'm afraid I don't. Again, wonderfully thoughtful guy, so much so that I know he travels to Washington on a regular basis, where the Federal Reserve is interested in his views about what's happening in the home building industry. And so he is a very natural respondent to this particular piece of work. And so I've asked Evgeny to speak for 15 to 20 minutes. Bert will have a 5 to 10 minute response, and then we will open it up to questions. And I will particularly encourage the audience to make us aware if there are things that they find in the report to not make sense to them, because this was survey data that's done, and we really are looking for grounding in people's experiences in the world as they listen to this. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A. I will be moderating the questions, and we look forward to your feedback on this. And so with that, I'm going to turn my camera off and ask Evgeny to turn his camera on to present our findings.
Hello, everyone. I'm Evgeny. Richard, thanks for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to present this report here today. Now, let me just quickly turn on screen sharing so that I can present. All right, can everyone see the slides? All right, so today, as Richard mentioned, I'll be presenting a report that we've recently finished using survey data titled "The Biggest and Smallest Barriers to California Housing Development, Survey Evidence from Developers, Planning Commissioners, and Housing Advocates." This was co-authored by Professor Richard Green and Lois Takahashi, both of them who are on the call. The report was funded by the California Home Building Foundation. I would also like to thank Honor Hayball for her excellent research assistance, because without her, a lot of this work would not have been possible. All right, so I'm just going to dive straight into it. I presume most of us are on the call are aware of the housing issues that prevail in California, namely very high housing prices, and housing prices just don't let up. They keep growing. One of the predominant reasons behind growing housing prices in California has been said to be a lack of housing construction. The California Legislative Analyst Office estimates that we need 70 to 110,000 new housing units every single year to avoid home prices from rising faster than the national average. And we're not building nearly as much. Some of the reasons that have been cited that for preventing more construction include local resistance, growth control ballot initiatives, cumbersome environmental review requirements, and some other reasons. So in this survey, we're primarily going to focus on the discretionary approval process. And if you're not familiar with it, namely, the developers have to go through a process where they submit various documents, including EIRs. And then these documents need to be approved by the Planning Commission, or I guess recommended to be approved or not approved, but a Planning Commission for each city. And then the City Council ultimately decides whether the project is going to go forward or not. And there are a lot of details in there, but we're not going to go into that. Our goal was essentially to see if we can find avenues for dialogue among the key stakeholders in the housing development process, and hopefully build mutual understanding among the key stakeholders. To achieve this, we solicit perceived barriers to housing development among the key stakeholders. And using the survey responses, we try to find areas in which stakeholders agree, disagree, and potential areas of potential blind spots, essentially, with each party. The survey we survey 3 populations. The first ones consist of city planning commissioners for cities with populations over 100,000 people. This includes about 66 cities. We didn't survey every single planning commissioner. We randomly selected one from each city to represent the city. We surveyed 30 housing developers with the assistance of Dan Dunmoyer through the California Building Industry Association. These 30 developers represent about 80% of California housing development within CBIA membership. And then finally, we also try to involve as many advocacy groups as we could. And by advocacy groups, we mean YIMBYs, NIMBYs, nonprofit, affordable housing developers, and all the associations we know, environmental groups, friends of groups, community organizations, things like that. The survey was administered anonymously online via Qualtrics. And the responses have been collected rather recently. So the survey was conducted just a couple of months ago, December 2020 to January 2021. The one thing that we'd like to caution our listeners before we dive deep into the results is the fact that our samples may suffer from selection bias, in that the responses may not necessarily be representative of the greater populations that they represent. As a result, we'd like to caution the listeners from interpreting the results in a statistical framework and see these responses more of as a compilation of perceptions from experts in the respective fields. There were a couple of questions. So I'm going to dive straight into the results because that's what we want to discuss here. We asked a couple of questions that overlap among the three groups. Namely, the questions were essentially the same, exactly the same across the 3 commissions, 3 populations. And we did this so we can compare their perceptions regarding key issues. The first question pertains to desire for new housing. And the question specifically was, how favorable do you think city councils, county boards have been regarding new housing development? There are a couple of, and we asked a similar question for planning commissioners. A couple of interesting patterns that emerge here. First, over 70% of planning commissioners said that they're a lot or a great deal favorable towards, or city councils are a great or a lot deal favorable towards new housing, which stands in somewhat contrast to the fact that over 90% of developers said somewhat the opposite, that city councils are only moderately or a little favorable towards new housing. And a similar pattern emerges among planning commissioners. So over 90% of planning commissioners said that they themselves are a moderate or a lot favorable towards new housing, while developers said the somewhat opposite, that over 90% of developers said that city commissions are either a moderate or a little favorable towards new housing. So essentially, there is a discrepancy between the parties about the favorability of municipal bodies regarding new housing development. We also see when we compare the city councils to commissions that planning commissions in general seem to be perceived more favorable towards new housing than city councils. And in general, the voices among advocates reflect the voices among developers. The second overlapping question that we asked pertains to public opposition. Namely, how much have planning commissions you work with been persuaded by public opposition arguments to new housing development? And here we have a similar sort of dichotomy that emerges. So over 80% of planning commissioners said that planning commissions are only a moderate or a little persuaded by public opposition, while over 90% of developers said that planning commissions are a moderate or a great deal responsive to or persuaded by public opposition. Similarly, for city councils, again, over 80% of commissioners said that city councils are a moderate or a little persuaded by public opposition, while over 40% of developers said that city councils are over or a great deal persuaded by public opposition. So again, we see that commissioners perceive themselves and city council to be less responsive to public opposition than what the developers believe. Advocates, perhaps because they're advocates, also believe that city councils are fairly responsive to public opposition. So over 90% of advocates believe that city councils are either a moderate or a lot or a great deal persuaded by public opposition. The final question the final overlapping question we asked all three parties pertain to planning commission priorities. And as we look at the graph on the right side, we actually see that there's a fair amount of agreement among the three groups, especially on the top priorities, right? So in the panel, we see that traffic congestion received the most number of votes in terms of top priorities, and affordable housing received the second largest number of votes in terms of priorities, which suggests that planning commissioners, developers, and advocates, they're all coming to the table knowing that traffic congestion and affordable housing are going to be an issue when going through the housing development approval process. We also allowed every party to write in responses under other. The advocates made the greatest use of this category to write in topics such as gentrification, homelessness, and housing stability. Again, none of the other parties mentioned this, which suggests that this is perhaps a field ripe for the building of mutual understanding, so to say. The other kind of quirk that emerged was the fact that only developers selected parking requirements. In fact, over 15% of developers said that parking requirements were a top priority for planning commissions. Neither advocates nor commissioners mentioned that. So again, perhaps an area for building mutual understanding. Now, besides overlapping questions, we also try to capture at least the known barriers and see what their perceptions of are for those barriers among each of the three parties. So the questions didn't quite align. Each of the parties received different types of questions, and we try to categorize their responses in terms of different types of barriers. And the first type of barrier perhaps are procedural barriers, right? So In that case, we see that over about 30% of planning commissioners said that the approval process takes too long, and that's generally a sentiment that was also visible among the developer responses. Developers also noted a few other issues, including the fact that the approval process takes so long that during that process, the planning commissions have staff turnover. They have turnover in planning commissioners and other issues. So very often, the process has to be almost restarted or completely redone due to changes. So there's not a lot of continuity within the process. So that's perhaps an issue. What's interesting is that about 80% of planning commissioners said that they have enough resources to fulfill their jobs, although there were some planning commissioners who did say that they would like to, more time to review documents and things like that. But in general, it seems that the process takes long, and if there are procedural barriers, it's not necessarily due to lack of resources. One thing that some planning commissioners mentioned were code compliance, namely the ability of developers to adhere to code compliance is a barrier for developers. Interestingly, no developer mentioned that. So we wonder if perhaps that's a blind spot for one of the parties. I'm not going to dive too much into it. I'm just going to get perhaps to the biggest stickler here, which is the plot on the right. Through our conversations with planning commissioners, there was a theme that arose, essentially saying that there are some planning commissioners who do not believe, who may not necessarily believe that there's a housing crisis in California. So we decided to put that to the test. We asked planning commissioners whether they think that there is enough housing, just enough housing, or too much housing in California, or within their jurisdictions, pardon me. When we see that about a third of planning commissioners said that there's just enough housing within their municipalities, within their jurisdiction, rather. And if there's just enough housing, then there's not as much need, I guess, or incentive rather, to approve new housing development. So that was, I think, a surprise for us. We also dove into CEQA and related barriers. Now, before we talk, we would like to mention that we're not opposed to CEQA. I think CEQA does a lot of great things in terms of protecting the environment, protecting local cultures, and much more. But it's not a perfect legislation. And there are a couple of issues, there are a couple of themes that arise from CEQA when we talk to developers. This includes mitigation fees. 37% of developers mentioned that CEQA, EIR, and their arbitrary interpretation is a barrier to CEQA, and this involves in mitigation requirements, mitigation fees that go into approving the process, approving the project. We also see that 50% of developers mentioned that they had to stop projects due to the impact fees that were levied by the either planning commissions or city councils. Similarly, 50% of developers said that they had to substantially alter projects due to mitigation requirements. And then 45% of developers said that they had to make substantial cuts to project density. Another interesting element of CEQA is that it allows for essentially any party to sue the developer for practically any reason. And there, of course, there are legitimate lawsuits, and then perhaps there are spurious lawsuits. Within that, we see that 37% of developers say that they have to settle a lawsuit during the development process at least half of the time. And then 54 developers said that legal challenges to their project ended recent projects. We also asked who are the litigants, who are the people who sue them. The top suing group were environmental groups, including Sierra, so forth. Second most common suing group were neighborhood groups and cities. And then the third most commonly mentioned were labor unions. What's interesting is that none of the commissioners mentioned litigation as an issue for housing construction. And to be fair, we didn't ask the commissioners specifically whether do they think litigation is an issue, but there were ample spots for write-ins, and litigation never came up. So again, an area ripe for building of mutual understanding. Public opposition, I think, is a fairly, at least anecdotally, acknowledged issue. Over 91% of developers said that NIMBYs and bananas impede development. What's interesting within this is that advocates, at least the ones who surveyed, said that they're generally supportive of new housing development, but there's a heavy emphasis on the desire for more affordable housing. And within that, over 60% of developers mentioned that they were, I guess, regularly pressured by the cities or planning commissions to include more affordable housing. In terms of issues on infrastructure and zoning, we see that 67% of developers say that cities should have by right zoning to allow for the construction of housing, the type of housing that they want. And if you're not familiar with by right zoning allows for administrative versus discretional approval. And discretional approval involves going through the planning commissions and city councils. And administrative approval basically eschews all of that. So there are a lot of, I guess, political risks and similar issues that come up with the regular approval process that does not arise when we look through by right zoning, by right approval rather. What's interesting is when we asked developers, they said that only about 12% said that the zoning and infrastructure were inadequate to accommodate city growth, which suggests that when developers are requesting by right zoning, it's primarily to get around the discretionary approval process. Among commissioners, when we asked similar questions, and 71% of them said that their cities have recently updated their master plan, their zoning, and so forth. So it seems that the cities are listening and they are trying to update zoning to I guess, reflect more modern growth projections and things like that. What's interesting and wasn't quite mentioned among very often by developers or commissioners were things mentioned by the advocates. Namely, there were 2 write-in answers by the advocates suggesting that cities need better infrastructure for transit-oriented development. There were a couple of developers who mentioned the need for more transit-oriented development, or for the need for more multifamily housing development, things like that. And only about 36% of advocates believe that zoning is inadequate. The final question we final section in the survey perhaps try to gauge how did the COVID-19 pandemic affected the development process. And the biggest question that we asked among the planning commissioners and developers was by how much were the approval processes delayed due to the pandemic. And again, as we saw over the overlapping questions, we saw a couple of interesting patterns emerge. Namely, 32% of commissioners said that there was no delay in the approval process, which again stands somewhat in sharp contrast to the fact that 60% of developers say that the approval process was delayed by 6 or more months. To be fair, that there is a fair number of agreement. About 26% of planning commissioners say that the approval process was also delayed by 6 months. So it seems that there is a fair amount of agreement within this field. We also asked if priorities changed among planning commissioners and advocates. And planning commissioners and advocates both mentioned that there is a priority, that the priorities have shifted towards the construction of more affordable housing and towards making sure that households are able to have some housing security. So what are the implications for dialogues? We have a couple of themes that arise throughout this. Notably, we see that planning commissions are perceived, perhaps city councils and themselves, as more favorable to new housing than developers or advocates for that matter, and that planning commissions generally are a bit more, favorable towards new housing than city councils. We also see that when when it comes to priorities, all the parties generally agree that traffic congestion and affordable housing are major issues. Finally, there's some agreement that there is need for updated zoning and infrastructure to accommodate growth. Then that there are procedural issues such as the planning process being too long and scheduling difficulties. And finally, a lot of developers want by right approvals, and some of the cities actually responding by providing by right approvals if they include affordable housing, for example. And then finally, COVID-19 has made everything worse, perhaps to no surprise. So that's about it. I'm not going to dive into future work, but feel free to ask questions and email us if you'd like to know more details. Again, thank you for letting me present, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
So Gene, thank you for that very clear presentation. Let me turn it over, and I did look it up. So Bert has been in charge of Shea Homes since 2002. You look at how young he looks, and it's just hard to believe that he's had a job that important for 19 years, but there it is. Bert, thanks for being willing to be a respondent. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Richard. And I didn't need these glasses 19 years ago. So anyway, it's great to be with all of you. A couple of shout outs, first of all, to CHF for funding. You do great jobs in the community, and this is one of them. I love the scholarships that you provide to kids to go into the state of real estate and home building in particular. Also to the USC Lusk and Price schools, I think it's fantastic that you're both working together, especially in a metropolis like LA. It's a great place to be. Gene, Lois, and Richard, I thought this was a long overdue study. I thought it was a nice survey. I think there's a lot more to come, and I think it's the tip of the iceberg, but it's a really good first start. I wrote down notes copiously while Gene was going through it. So let me provide responses to the survey, and then kind of my thoughts on kind of how we got here, and then I'm happy to we could answer questions, or Richard, whatever you prefer to do. When I look at it overall, the results of the survey are generally very consistent with our experience. You have a lot of good people in the planning commissions and in city councils, but the process sometimes doesn't work, and a lot of times it doesn't work. And I'll give some examples, but with regard to the scenario where the planning commission approves and then it's overturned by the city council, it does happen. And the reason why it happens predominantly is the planning commissioners are basically looking at a project or new community from a very objective standpoint. Does it meet zoning requirements? Does it meet general plan requirements? Does it meet, various requirements that are pretty objective? And so, does it hitting the zoning guidelines, et cetera? But when it gets to the city council, it's very different. They're more prone to look at the projects a lot more subjectively. The other fundamental issue that is just a misalignment, and why there's going to be a little bit of difference is planning commissioners are appointed and city council members are elected. And that kind of tells you have a little bit of different bosses, so to speak. Controversial projects, sometimes it's as controversial as just building more housing in a community. Our political lightning rods for some city councilmen and councilmen and councilwomen to get the attention of advocacy groups and to establish goodwill with their electorate. And that is just a fact of life. We're seeing that every day in politics across the board. It's not saying that they're not doing a good job, but they're balancing that where the planning commissioners are basically looking at more, to make sure that things are done by the standards that were set before. One of the studies, Gene, that might be interesting to do in the future is looking at what happens during an election year, because we have noticed that during election years, especially for council people, our projects get delayed. And I think I look back on history and I don't know of one pro-growth politician that has held a position for any period of time. And we clearly need housing, and I'll talk to some reasons about that. So that's my kind of planning commissioner versus city council. The other items, notes I've taken on development barriers, kind of the elephant in the room is the infrastructure. That is something that is talked about a lot, but it's not really defined. I guess I look at infrastructure as streets, roads, schools, water, fire departments, those things that are essential to it. And, I just don't feel like whenever we go to a city, what we hear quite often is we can't even keep up with our current needs. How are we going to add more housing? And I look at COVID, you touched on that, Gene. COVID to me was a perfect opportunity to get out and build the roads. There was nobody on the roads, right? We should have had an emergency plan in many of our cities to say, in the event that this happens, can we build the roads or, start a variety of other projects that are hard to do when it's not COVID time. But anyway, I tend to look at things that way. Zoning is another barrier. I just think there's not enough housing supply identified in general plans. We need more land set aside for housing. And that's just a consistent, when you look at how undersupplied and underbuilt we have been in California the last, decade or so. I mean, one of the statistics that I could share with you is that California should be building about 180,000 homes a year, right? I think right now between single family and multifamily, we're probably doing 85,000. If you look at just two cities in Texas, Dallas and Houston, those two cities built more homes in 2020 than we had permits or starts in all of California, in the entirety of California. If you think about our population, we've got 39.5 million people. Texas has got 29 million people. So in two cities, that's not including Austin, it's not including San Antonio. You put those and it blows it out. The point is that we are well undersupplied, and we need, I think zoning should take that into consideration. Other issues of the report, the high impact fees is really driving up the cost of what we build and do in California. For instance, what do we pay on each house? We pay building permit fees, we pay water and sewer fees, we pay school fees, we pay traffic fees, we pay park fees, and the list goes on and on. I mean, it is significant. When I look at the fees that we pay in California per house, just for the building permit alone is about $25,000 to $50,000. So say on average, $37,500 per permit. If you look at our divisions in Las Vegas and Nevada or in Arizona, their average is $7,000. So we are at $37,000 in building permit in California. They are in $7,000. I mean, if you do the math, it's 5x, and it shouldn't be that much different. To be honest, that just shouldn't be the case. So, the barriers and costs are creating a housing supply shortage, and thus a tremendous demand for very limited homes, and prices are going through the roof. And that's something that we need to be very careful with, because what it's doing is it's driving a lot of out migration. We're seeing it. We build across the country. We build in 10 states and numerous markets in each of those states. And I look at our out migration numbers this morning. I was looking at a report, 39% of our interest list to buy a home pre-approved in Boise, Idaho, 39% of those are from California. In Arizona, it's 22%. In Las Vegas, the number of buyers is 30% of our home buyers in Las Vegas are from California. In Washington State, it's 9%. So there's a lot of people that are leaving. And unfortunately, a lot of those people leaving are not the wealthy. They're those working class folks that can't afford a house here that are going to support other economies and other areas. So anyway, it's led to out migration and obviously skyrocketing prices because there's so little supply that's an issue. So those are my thoughts on Gene's paper. Let me talk real quick about kind of how we got here, in my opinion, just at a high level. You know, we had tremendous growth in California from the 1940s to the 1970s. And I think it pushed us, we were so overwhelmed by that growth, it pushed us as a state to a slow growth mentality, you know, and that's happened through municipal and statewide entities that govern land use, approval, and new housing. Well, the pendulum has swung the other way. I think we've gone so far back that, you know, we should be building about 180,000 homes a year, like I had mentioned, and we're building 85,000 a year. That's an issue. The other thing that I look at is just the excessive regulation. You know, if you look at the regulation that we deal with today, we've got planning groups, planning commissions, planning departments, CEQA regulations, environmental regulatory agencies, to name a few. I mean, I could go on, the list goes on. And the filter creates additional costs. And what it really does is it creates time delays. And in our business, time is money. And that's, you know, that adds up because you're not, a lot of times you're borrowing this money and every day that passes. And when I look at the time, for instance, just on a simple building permit in Arizona, for instance, it takes about 2 weeks. In Las Vegas, it takes about 2 weeks. In California, to get a building permit, it's anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks. And I don't understand why that is, but that amount of time, you know, an extra month is adds to the cost. So the other thing I'd just say is it seems like there's a maze of bureaucracy that's taken over. You've got really good people in commissions, councils, working in the city offices, but the processes I just feel need to be picked apart and looked at differently, like we would in kind of private industry, so to speak. So when I throw out some solutions, I'll throw it out just for conversation. First, I think we need to realize that we have a problem, and that problem is that we're short on housing, and it's creating a lot of issues to the extreme of homelessness, that there are people that can't keep up with the payments, and it drives that, and then workforce housing, and we're driving people out. So we need to realize there's a problem. Second, we need to define what success is in the process. Is it achieving a certain amount of quotas of approvals? Is it some type of time frame adherence to that? Today there is none, right? It could take as long as it wants, and really the onus is on the developer on that front. Next, I'd say redefine the scope of review for every regulatory agency. It feels like there's a lot of agencies that have their hand in the cookie jar, and in the meantime, you're getting scrambled around trying to satisfy the needs of all of them. So I think that would be something else. Again, the look at the bureaucracy of the redundant regulations. I think that's something we need to look at. And then I think a big one is introduce technology, you know, using artificial intelligence or other forms of technology can take months and months and months worth of processing down to a very short period of time if used appropriately. And I just don't see that happening as much. And that was really evidence to us in COVID in dealing with a lot of planning commissions, that even sending over files and those type of things were difficult. But some did great. You know, we now have aerial footage that we could see every week, our progress on land development in communities. And there should be some type of information like that. So with that, I will turn it back, Richard, to you to ask anything or lead the discussion as you see fit.
So Bert, thank you very much for those remarks. And let me ask Lois and Jean to turn their cameras on, and Dan for that matter, because I think when I look at the questions that have come through, I think the entire group can participate in answering them. Bert, the one comment I would make in response to what you said, though, is maybe the state legislature will be upset enough by the fact that California lost a congressional seat, which is, I think, because it's not that people don't want to be in California. We know that because house prices keep going up.
Yeah.
If the issue were that people don't want to live here, you would see house prices falling because there wouldn't be there'd be vacancy, right? So you see, states like Michigan and Ohio losing congressional seats. Well, that's people leaving because there just is an opportunity there. Sorry to say about those places, but that's how they are. Pennsylvania as well. And here it's that there's just no place for people to live. And so the way to keep a congressional seat next time around is to make sure there are enough houses that you don't have people fleeing, at least, or that they're fleeing in smaller numbers than they are right now. And so since political power and money seems to matter to people, maybe this will be a wake-up call. I'm not that hopeful, but at least it's something. So let me start working through. So we've gotten a number of really good comments here, questions. Some of them are comments, but the first one is, it's ironic to hear planning commissioners believe they are favorable toward housing. That's simply not my experience. As recently as the last 5 plan commission meetings I've attended across LA County in the last, this is cut off. In the last 2 months on 4 different project types and sizes, I would love to learn the percentage of plan commission respondents' approval of housing projects to see what is really happening. And I think that would be a great metric to compare with just asking people. So that's another project which will require more graduate students. And so I'm just putting it out there. So we can't really answer that particular question, but yeah, it's one thing to say we're going to approve things and something else to actually do it. From Ben Tony, this is again a really interesting comment. Oh, and Jean is typing an answer. So Jean, instead of typing an answer to it, why don't you read the question and answer it?
Interestingly, I was typing the answer, believing that I knew it, and then it dawned on me that I don't actually. But the question asks, 45% said they have recently given density bonuses. And this, he's referring to planning commissioners, of whom 45% said that they have recently given density bonuses to projects that provide some sort of affordable housing. His question is, or that they give bonuses above and beyond state law requirements, aren't those compelled by state if the projects qualify? And I guess the one thing that I can say is that the state law has a particular threshold, and I forgot. Maybe the other respondents know. I think maybe it's 50% to get a density bonus or something like that. But cities basically can require much lower levels in order to require, or in order to approve, in order to give density bonuses. I don't know if Richard or Louis want to speak more to this.
Yeah, the shape of what you said is correct, Jean. I do not remember the particulars of the numbers right now. So, but again, it may be, and again, we didn't parse out that particular answer in our questionnaire. And so it's certainly a question worth exploring in future research on this.
Richard, if I could just add one thought.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan, please.
The question author is correct. There are greater flexibilities here, but it's really interesting. The question, do we need more laws in California to change our housing situation? The answer is yes, but it's amazing how many laws are already on the book that would address a lot of these issues. But here's the reality of it. The commissioners will say, well, yes, we should grant you a density bonus, but the pressure we're receiving from the community is to keep these bigger homes, bigger lots, and less. So if you wish to litigate this, you'll probably win. That will take you 3 to 5 years. And so, but if you'll agree to build less, we'll approve it and move it forward. And so you accept it as a builder developer because, as Bert said so accurately, time is money. So part of the reality of the fact is there's a lot of good laws in the books, but do you wish to go through that fight? Or do you wish just to kind of try to get to yes? And that's oftentimes why people kind of beat us up saying you should build smaller, better homes at a better price point and do it more quickly. And you'll see many of our projects, like the one that Shea Homes has in Livermore, started 20 years ago. Originally offered at $400,000, is now selling at $880,000 because it took 20 years. They had to make all these changes. And that's why Shea Homes is selling it at $880,000, even though their original plan 20 years ago was half that price. So that's the challenge you see. It's not that the laws aren't good, it's to get to yes. You tend just to not push back and get to yes.
And Dan, that's a great point. And the misnomer is that all that, that doubling in price is all coming to us, right?
Correct.
That it's all profit. It's not even close. If you probably look at it, we're probably in an 8 to 10% profit before tax, and then probably 4 to 5% after tax. That's a lot of risk over 20 years. We've got a community in Southern California near the water that's took 21 years to get entitled. And again, it's not saying that we go away from it. It's just that when you look at what the intent of a lot of these laws and regulations were, they've gotten lost, and everybody's used it to, kind of increase the cost of housing. Dan, if you could, I would love for you to just talk about, just to give, the audience here an idea of what's on the books for regulation, like VMT in San Diego, vehicle miles traveled, just to show the extreme of what we're talking about, because I think that's a great example.
So vehicle miles traveled is a concept that comes out of Senate Bill 743 by former Senate leader Darrell Steinberg, now the mayor of Sacramento. It's a law that says let's put a fee on a home if it results in a commute. So we want to encourage urban infill, and we want to encourage building up, not out. And so the fee that's being proposed to the San Diego Board of Supervisors on the 19th of May is, if it's more than 2 miles from the urban core, it's a $100,000 added fee. If it's more than 20 miles, it's a $2 million per home added fee. And so the idea being, if you would just build tall buildings in the urban core, you would be able to solve this vehicle miles traveled and the greenhouse gas impact. The urban core homes that they're suggesting start at a roughly $1.5 to $2 million. Why so much? Because when you build 5 to 10 stories, it costs you 5 times more than you build a single family or duplex stick structure. So what does it mean? It means you have to be wealthy to live in San Diego if the Board of Supervisors adopt these fees. So that's on top of all the EIR fees, developer fees Bert outlined. That's an additional fee intending to change human behavior and trying to urge urban infill. Again, 2 miles from the urban core, I would not say is a long commute. Probably even take a bus, but to add $100,000 per door means that a middle-class family is priced out, and they'll move to Arizona or Las Vegas or Boise, not because they necessarily want to, it's they have to. So that's an example of a regulation that's well-intentioned. Its goal is noble. Its impact means there's no middle-class housing in San Diego if the Board of Supervisors approves this.
So here's a question from, again, an anonymous attendee. There's another question that I think you more or less just answered, actually. But it notes that Berkeley has recently ended single-family zoning, beginning in 2022. And this is something where we've seen it in Oregon, we've seen it in Minneapolis. Do you see this as possibly happening more broadly in California? And I think, Lois sort of has her finger on the pulse of Sacramento, but Bert and Dan as well, too. Anyone want to take on that question?
Lois, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, so I'm being thrown to the dogs here. So, I think a lot of people are paying attention to this. Whether or not it's going to have this domino effect, I think it's another question. I don't really know what's going to happen, but I think people are watching Berkeley and they're watching Minneapolis and they're trying to see what the effects are going to be. So that's maybe we should study that, Richard.
Yeah, Bert?
We didn't include that question.
No, we
so-
did. We didn't. It's a good question. I mean, one of the things that occurred that I think people fear that if you do this, suddenly their neighborhoods are going to change overnight. And I understand why people are fearful, because I mean, I live in Pasadena in a single family neighborhood that I think would be ripe for duplexes. And certainly people were freaking out about ADUs, and now ADUs are coming in. It turns out they're totally fine. But in most places, the economics of tearing down the single family house and replacing it with a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex just doesn't work. The current house is more valuable than the implicit value of the land underneath the triplex would be. So it's not like you're going to suddenly have this massive change in 5 years or 10 years. But there are particular lots where it really makes sense. And particularly, we see teardowns all the time, right? But not particularly productive as people tear down older, smaller houses and put up newer, bigger ones that are McMansions. And it could be that the higher and better use of the teardown is, in fact, to do a duplex or a triplex. And with that, you create affordability and density, as opposed to the opposite, which happens when you put a bigger house on the lot. So what I'm hoping is people will see that this stuff is not that scary, and it will be more broadly accepted in the years to come.
I mean, just on that, Richard, the legislature in California has been very reticent to push for, greater density. Obviously, Senator Wiener tried to lead the charge last year in SB 50, and it was referred to as a Manhattanization of San Francisco, which last time I checked, San Francisco is not a small city, but the bill was killed because of the fear of building up and changing the culture and fabric of communities, direct quotes. So there is tends to be a reticence or hesitation to allow for greater density, even if it's capped at 4 stories.
Changing the culture and fabric of community are lines that white supremacists used to use to keep neighborhoods segregated.
That's exactly what Senator Wiener reminded his colleagues. It was his colleagues from the city of Los Angeles that killed it. Out of that fear, that great concern. So there is not, Berkeley is an example, but by the way, Berkeley is not approving any housing projects per se. So that's part of the challenge is a lot of laws, a lot of changes, a lot of opportunities are presented, but it really comes down to Bert's number of how many permits are pulled. And even though the demand...
But let me ask you about that. So Berkeley now has gotten rid of single family zoning. That means, and I don't, is it triplexes you can do? Up to triplexes, I think. That means it's by right. You don't need to get permission. I mean, you need to show that the building conforms to the building standards, but you do that, you pull the building permit and you're done, right? Or no?
No. Yeah, it's not that quick. It's not that
Okay.
No
Why
way.
is, I mean, I understand bigger projects, you have CEQA, but a triplex is not going to be subject to a CEQA challenge. So what is the mechanism where once it's by right, the process gets slowed down?
I mean, generally speaking, by right doesn't exist in much of the state. One of the questionnaires asked about Senate Bill 35, which is a by right concept, where if you do 50% affordable, use prevailing wage, we call it a unicorn bill because it requires all these things. So there's been 3 major projects that have been by righted and they're in litigation. They have not been built. And this is a Senator Wiener bill of 5 years ago. So again, the concept, unlike the state of Washington, very green, very progressive, very environmentally friendly. By right means by right. If it's zoned for 100 homes, you build 100 homes. In California, by right means that's where you start the discussion. We don't have true by right, even with SB 35. Those are litigated projects that continue to be sued, litigated. The developers are winning those lawsuits, but how many years has that been? How much does that cost? And eventually, as was pointed out by the survey, litigation means half the builders and developers walk away from the project. Delay crushes the project. And that's, if you're an NIMBY, that's a genius strategy. If you're trying to solve the housing crisis, it's the wrong strategy.
Well, forgive the self-promotion, but I made a short video about a month ago on time is money. And just the way to think about it is suppose that your equity investor, the first hurdle is 8% before the developer gets paid anything. 5 years, and let's say land is half the value of a construction project. 5 years, you're looking at with compounding about a 25% increase in cost just because of the weight. It has nothing to do with materials, nothing to do with labor, just because of the weight. So,
Hey, Richard,
yeah.
Just to that point, that I totally concur with Dan. There's nothing I see that's by right. But think about your example of in Berkeley, you do a triplex on the building. Then you get the neighborhood community coming in saying, well, I don't like the architecture, so I want that to be changed. And how many people are going to live there? And what's the size of it? And you could say that all you want. It gets back to my point of the planning commission could say it's checked all the quote by right boxes, but now you get the city council that's getting lobbied by everybody. That's when the rubber hits the road, and it's not as easy a process as it may seem.
So a really good, Lois, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to read, because we're coming up to the top of the hour. I just want to make sure we got Dunmoyer's question in.
Yeah, I was just going to do that. But please go ahead, Lois. No, take it away.
So I'll put this out to everybody on the panel. Dunmoyer, who's a very famous demographer at USC Price, asks, does building in the urban core encounter greater resistance than suburban development?
Answer is yes. That's our challenge as builders. So the leadership of the legislature, Office of Planning and Research, Governor's Office, much of the environmental community is asking us to do the urban core, and Dr. Myers is raising, but that's where we receive the greatest litigation for CEQA. We have a joke that NIMBYs file CEQAs, cows don't. The reason why I mention cows is if you go into the green fields where cows are, there's less litigation for environmental quality, but that's not where the environmental community wants us to build. When you go into the urban core and you start saying, hey, we could build a 5-story building here, the neighbors wake up, they bring in CEQA, they bring in litigation, everything Bert said about we don't like the design, we want a different architecture, we want something that looks more like 1910 than 2020. That's where you get the delay, the litigation, and the other complexity. So we have the schizophrenia. We want you as a building community to build in the urban core, but we have the most litigation there. And then in the greenfield space, we don't want you to build out there, but that's one where the demand is, especially post-COVID. People want a single-family detached, little tiny backyard, so their 3-year-old's not screaming on the 7th floor of an urban infill apartment in San Francisco. So you have this consumer demand versus political direction. And these are worlds that are colliding. It's a policy schizophrenia with the market schizophrenia. So we are asked and urged to build in the urban core. VMT encourages that, but that's not what the neighbors want.
Absolutely well put.
I'm sorry, Bert, go ahead.
I just said well put, and then you get into the cost side of it, and with all those delays and what it costs to do in an inner city or in the inner core, it becomes prohibitive.
So I think perhaps the most important reform we could have in California is to make by right development, which means if you have the use and if you have the bulk, and of course you meet building codes, it really is by right. And I tell the story. I lived in Madison, Wisconsin for many years, a very liberal, very environmentally conscious city. I was on the plan commission for Madison, and by right meant most stuff didn't come to us. It was ministerial. If you conformed to zoning, you went to the planning office, you brought the plans, and within a week you had an answer, yes, your plans conform to zoning or no, they don't, and on you went. And our entire job as a plan commission and the city council was to approve conditional use permits, which were very transparent what they were and what the standards were for approval or disapproval, or full rezonings. And otherwise, the zoning was the zoning, and you got to do what the zoning said you got to do.
Yeah, Richard, pretty much most everywhere else we build, that's kind of how it is. And it's just builders I know from other parts of the country just think we're crazy for building in California, because they just say, I don't even understand it. It's like a different planet, and it's different. One of my peers, I love his comment when asked by a politician, well, why aren't you building homes, affordable homes for Californians? His remark was, we are, they just happen to be based in Las Vegas and in Phoenix.
And with that happy note, we have reached the top of the hour. I'd like to thank my partners in this endeavor, Lois Takahashi and Evgeny Burinskiy. I'd like to thank Dan and the BIA for, actually it's this California Home Building Foundation for supporting this research. Bert, thank you for your very thoughtful comments. Thank you everybody for coming, and we'll see you again.